What's the weirdest thing you've seen in someone else's home? I've been a dog walker for about 5 years now, and I've seen my fair share of weird stuff in people's homes. From the lady who insisted on dressing her poodle up in matching outfits to the guy who had an entire room dedicated to his cat's Instagram account. Yes, you read that right. I thought I'd seen it all. But nothing, and I mean nothing, could have prepared me for what I saw at the Smith's house. It started like any other walk. Mrs. Smith had booked me to take her 2 golden retrievers, Max and Bella, out for a 30-minute stroll around the block. She lived in this beautiful old house on the outskirts of town, surrounded by trees and a huge backyard that seemed perfect for dogs. As I arrived at the house, Mrs. Smith greeted me at the door with a warm smile and handed over the leashes. "Be careful with them today, dear," she said. "They can get a bit rambunctious." I nodded and took off with Max and Bella, enjoying the crisp afternoon air and the sound of birds chirping in the trees. When we got back to the house, Mrs. Smith invited me in for a glass of water before I headed out. As we walked into the living room, I noticed something odd. There was this thing sitting on the couch next to Mrs. Smith's husband, Mr. Smith. At first, I thought it was a really realistic stuffed animal, or maybe even one of those creepy robot dogs that are all the rage these days. But as I got closer, I realized it was something much weirder. It was a taxidermied raccoon wearing a tiny little sweater and holding a miniature guitar. I did my best not to stare, but let's be real, it was hard not to. And Mrs. Smith introduced me to Rocky, their beloved former pet raccoon who had passed away a few years ago. "Oh, Rocky loved music," Mr. Smith chimed in enthusiastically. "We used to play him records all day long." I smiled politely and nodded along, trying not to think about how weird it was that they were still keeping their dead raccoon in their living room. As I sipped my water and tried to process the whole Rocky situation, Mrs. Smith started telling me about their other pets. They had a few birds in the backyard aviary, a couple of cats lounging in the sunbeams streaming through the windows, and even a hedgehog named Hector who lived in a special enclosure in the basement. I was starting to think that maybe Rocky was just a one-off weirdness, but then Mr. Smith mentioned that they also had a special room in the house that they liked to call the museum. My curiosity was piqued, and I asked if I could see it. Mrs. Smith exchanged a look with her husband and then nodded. "Okay, but you have to promise not to freak out," she said with a sly smile. I promised, and Mr. Smith led me down a narrow hallway lined with old family photos and into a room that can only be described as surreal. The first thing I saw was a 2-headed turtle preserved in a jar on a shelf. Next to it was a vintage medical skeleton wearing a top hat and holding a cane. There were shelves upon shelves of strange artifacts, antique medical equipment, old taxidermied animals, including what looked like a giant squirrel wearing roller skates, and even what appeared to be an authentic shrunken head from some far-flung jungle tribe. But the pièce de résistance was the centerpiece of the room, an entire wall dedicated to, wait for it, Bigfoot memorabilia. There were newspaper clippings about Sasquatch sightings, plaster casts of giant footprints, and even what looked like an authentic, or at least very convincing, lock of Bigfoot hair encased in glass. I stood there with my mouth agape, trying to wrap my head around what I was seeing. Mr. Smith noticed my reaction and chuckled. "We're both huge cryptozoology enthusiasts," he explained proudly. "We've spent years collecting all this stuff." I nodded politely again, still trying not to freak out, as promised. But as we left the museum and headed back into the living room, I couldn't help but wonder what other secrets this house held. As I finished my water and prepared to leave, Mrs. Smith asked if I wanted to take a quick tour of the backyard before I headed out. I agreed, still trying to process the sheer weirdness of the museum. As we walked out into the sun-drenched yard, I noticed that it was even more impressive than I had expected. There were bird feeders and bird baths galore, a small pond with a fountain, and even a little gazebo in the corner. But what caught my attention was the shed in the far corner of the yard. It looked like your average garden shed, but there was something about it that seemed off. "What's in the shed?" I asked Mrs. Smith casually. She hesitated for a moment before responding. "Oh, that's just Mr. Smith's project room." I raised an eyebrow. "Project room?" "Yes," she said quickly. "He likes to tinker with things in there." I nodded, but my curiosity was piqued. What kind of projects could Mr. Smith be working on that required an entire shed? As we walked back towards the house, I noticed that Mr. Smith had disappeared into the shed. I tried to brush it off as him just going to grab something, but then I heard strange noises coming from inside. It sounded like singing. I turned to Mrs. Smith, who was watching me with an intense gaze. "What's going on?" I asked her quietly. She leaned in close and whispered, "You didn't hear anything." I felt a shiver run down my spine as Mr. Smith emerged from the shed, looking flushed and excited. "Time for you to go," Mrs. Smith said abruptly, handing me my payment for the dog walk. I took it quickly and beat a hasty retreat out of there, wondering what secrets they were hiding in that shed. As I walked back to my car, I couldn't shake off the feeling that something was off about the Smiths and their house. The taxidermied raccoon, the weird museum, and now the mysterious shed. It all added up to a sense of unease that I couldn't quite explain. I decided to do some digging and see if I could find out more about the Smiths. A quick online search revealed that they were both retired professors from a local university, with Mrs. Smith having taught biology and Mr. Smith having taught music theory. That's when it clicked. The singing I had heard coming from the shed wasn't just random noise. It was Mr. Smith working on some kind of music project. But what kind of music project required a shed in the backyard? I decided to do some more snooping and drove back to the neighborhood that night, parking my car a few blocks away from the Smith's house. I snuck back into their yard, trying to get a peek into the shed without being seen. As I approached the shed, I heard it again, singing, but this time accompanied by instruments. It sounded like a choir. I peeked through a window, and what I saw blew my mind. Inside the shed was a group of people, all dressed in robes, gathered around Mr. Smith, who was conducting them with wild abandon. They were singing in harmony, their voices soaring and dipping in perfect pitch. But it wasn't just any song they were singing. It was an eerie, haunting melody that sent shivers down my spine. And then I saw Rocky, perched on a pedestal in front of them, his glassy eyes seeming to stare right at me. I knew then that I had stumbled into something much weirder than just a quirky old couple with a taxidermied raccoon. I hightailed it out of there as fast as I could, not stopping until I was back in my car and speeding away from that strange house. I never went back to walk those dogs again, but sometimes at night when it's quiet, I still hear that haunting melody echoing in my mind.